نحمده ونصلي على رسوله الكريم وعلى عبده المسيح الموعود أما بعد فأعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. Today we begin our first Iqra Ta'limul Qur'an and Tabligh class. The wisdom or the intention behind this class in particular is taking inspiration from the first revelation that the Holy Prophet ﷺ received in the form of Iqra, which means to read, but it also meant to convey, meaning to learn what we have received from Allah Almighty, and after learning and applying it to our own lives, conveying it to those who are our brothers and sisters as the creation of Allah and inviting them toward Allah. So I have a very exciting topic lined up for you today. There are a number of key concepts, inshallah, that I will try to cover, and I will try my level best, inshallah. I hope Allah Ta'ala grants me the ability to stay within the time, and inshallah I'm hopeful that you'll have a number of new perspectives presented to you. Now, the verse that we'll be studying today in particular is verse 50 from chapter 51 of the Holy Qur'an. So particularly those of you who are at home, you're most welcome to open the Qur'an and look for this verse yourselves. But for your ease, I've also taken the verse out here, and inshallah you can take a look here, and then we'll move on to the presentation. So Allah Ta'ala states in the Holy Quran, وَمِن كُلِّ شَيْءٍ, and of everything. وَمِن كُلِّ شَيْءٍ, and of everything. خَلَقَنَا, we have created زَوْجَيْن, pairs, لَعَلَّكُمْ تَذَكَّرُونَ, so that you may reflect. Now, when we read this particular verse of the Holy Quran, what we often do is we have a very simplistic understanding of this verse. And what we take it to mean is that, well, this is so natural that we witness all around us that there are pairs. You know, there is pairs in human beings where you have male and female coming together, husband and wife, etc. And we observe pairings all across the world. And sometimes we limit our understanding to this, but what I'll try to demonstrate to you today is that there is far deeper meaning in this singular verse of the Holy Quran, which should open up an entire world to you, inshallah. Right? So let's start off with the basics. Now, as I've just mentioned, the first thing that we obviously do after reading this verse of the Holy Quran is that we reflect and we observe. And there are a number of explanations and examples that the promised Messiah ﷺ has given to explain to us what pairing actually means. Right? So one very crucial example that the Holy Prophet, or that the promised Messiah ﷺ gives, is that if you observe reality, if you observe creation, nothing actually works on its own. So the idea of pairing is not just that, for example, in marriage you supposedly have someone who is destined for you or your soulmate, etc. The idea of pairing is not just the idea of how, you know, you've got two hands and you've got 2 feet and you've got 2 ears and you've got 2 shoes, etc. But in actuality, the idea of pairing goes far deeper into the fact that in actuality, everything in this world depends on something else for its existence. Right? So a few examples that the promised Messiah ﷺ gives is that, for example, we have certain faculties. And he relates this to the attribute of Rahman. Right? The gracious God has granted us certain faculties. One, He has granted us eyes. He has granted us lungs. He has granted us a plethora of things. But interestingly, where the naturalists, they sometimes try to disprove the existence of God purely based on faculties which they describe to be a result of natural selection, a natural process of inevitability, right? Where you have eyes and you have lungs which have produced over many, many, many years. But Hazrat Masih Maud argues one thing. He says, yeah, that's fine. Biologically, it's absolutely possible that through a system of natural selection, your eyes and your lungs and etc. have come about. But then what about all the things which are completely separate to your being? And so much so, one example that's given in Our God by Hazrat Mirza Bashir Ahmed radiallahu anhu, he says that, we talk about the photosynthesis that takes place within the blades of grass and the greenery that is found all around us. But the perfect positioning of the sun so many million miles away, which is required for the photosynthesis to occur, and for these two realities to be entirely distinct from one another, pushes us to at least consider that there must be more to this universe than what meets the eye, right? There's one thing, our faculties coming about in isolation, but nothing is in isolation. Everything is dependent on something else. Our eyes, they're useless if there's no light. You cannot see anything if there's no light to be reflected into the eyes. The lungs, we require them to breathe, but if there is no oxygen, the lungs are absolutely useless, right? And then you can give so many examples, even things that we've now produced based on the knowledge that Allah Ta'ala has granted us, such as the car. The car requires fuel for it to operate. Without fuel, the car is not going to go so far, right? So what does the Holy Qur'an say? The Holy Qur'an is pointing towards a pattern, and it says, and of everything, we have created pairs that you may reflect. So again, as we go deeper down the rabbit hole and we try to understand what this means, this verse is not just making a statement, as I've just mentioned to you, right? Sometimes we just take it as a very simple statement, a matter of fact. What it's actually telling you is لَعَلَّكُمْ تَذَكَّرُونَ, right? It is inviting you to think, and it's inviting you to reflect and actually understand that on the basis of this principle, there is a pattern within the universe that we must understand and reflect upon, right? Not just observe, but actually try to understand what it really means to us. What does this pattern mean? What does it imply? And what it implies, as I've tried to describe to you, nothing in this world, in existence, stands on its own. Everything in actuality, in existence, is dependent on something else. Nothing in this world is self-sufficient. Nothing at all. Right? And what we learn from this is that in creation, there is a fundamental rule that is of dependence, that is of relationships, that is of balance. Everything requires something else for it to exist. And this will be made more clear to you as I give you a few more examples. Now, we'll go through a number of examples. We'll go through an example from biology, we'll go through an example from physics, we'll go through an example from chemistry. We'll even go through an example from human relationships, interpersonal relationships, which to a degree belong to the subjective world, right? So what do we learn from biology? So for example, DNA, the language of life, right? What is DNA? Every single cell in our body, right, has something known as DNA, and what it is basically an instruction manual. And that instruction manual is telling your body how to basically operate. But even in this most fundamental thing within the human body, right, there is a system of pairing, again, that Allah Ta'ala has pointed towards, right? So for example, those of you who've studied biology would know that we've discovered that adenine pairs only with thymine, cytosine pairs only with guanine, etc., right? And the interesting thing is, this is not interchangeable, right? It's fixed. If at any time this pairing doesn't occur appropriately, then what you have is your body starting to dysfunction, etc. Right? And it quite literally acts like a lock and key. If you get the correct pairing, then the body will operate appropriately. Otherwise, the cells start to malfunction, right? And what results in that is ultimately disease and death, etc. Right? So again, life at its most fundamental level also depends on correct pairing, a stability of rules, and something known as consistent relationships, right? Now, moving on in biology, we know that in biology we learn about reproduction, etc. But something which is very interesting that we learn about human pairings from biology as well in particular is that male and females, they're not imitations of one another. And if they were to be imitations of one another, then we wouldn't have a successful pairing either. Right? So sometimes when we're thinking about pairs, sometimes, because again, when we look at it from a very simplistic lens, we see two hands and we think two hands are an imitation of one another. We see two ears and we think that it's an absolute reflection of one another. So sometimes we limit our understanding of pairing to this, but what the Holy Qur'an is teaching us is actually something slightly different. The Holy Qur'an is explaining to us that even in the system of pairing, there is something which is known as specialized contribution, which means that these two entities are not entirely alike, and if they were, then you would not actually have much success, right? And this is something, again, we learn from human biology. We understand that a female contributes specific things and a male contributes specific type of information, which then ultimately results in a child, right? And the variation and the differentiation between the two coming together in cooperation is what results in something beautiful, right? So there's two things which hopefully now slowly should be becoming more and more clearer to us. One, that pairing does not mean imitation, it does not mean reflection. Pairing means coming together and there being differences harmonizing with one another, producing something beautiful, right? And we can go again back to the simple example that was given earlier, which is an example of the Promised Messiah, ﷺ. There's a pairing between light and your eyes, but light and your eyes are completely two distinct realities. But when they work together, you're able to produce something known as vision, right? So the same is the case in human pairings and human biology, etc. But the other thing which is even more important for us to understand is the idea of contingency. That everything is contingent on something else for it to be able to exist, right? Hopefully this is something which is becoming more and more clearer. Same thing applies to physics, right? So again, in physics, what we notice is for electricity to exist, you need two distinct things to pair together for there to be a charge, something known as positive charge and something known as negative charge. If there was only one type of charge, right, there would be no flow. Current would not flow at all. It would be completely stagnant. Atoms would not form, right? The basic constituents of life itself, smallest thing in existence, would not be able to form if there wasn't a variation in positive and negative charge, etc. And that's when you're looking at it from a micro level. But when you look at it at a macro level, entire sciences wouldn't exist, like chemistry and biology, and technology would be entirely impossible, right? So again, what we learn is atoms and existence itself is based on the correct pairing of negatively charged electrons, positively charged nuclei, and these forces, even if they're slightly altered and they don't pair correctly, you have what is known as collapse, right? And to a degree, destruction. And we can go further, right? We can look into chemistry. We've looked at biology, we've looked at physics, you can look at chemistry as well. Chemistry as well, interestingly, what we learn from chemistry is the concept of compositions, bonds, and even the transformation of elements, right? And interestingly, what we learn is elements, or particularly atoms, they're not sufficient on their own. And to a degree, they tend to be quite unstable until they are paired correctly. So one very basic example is of something that you use day in, day out. Every time you cook, most probably, you use a pinch of it, which is salt, right? But salt, known as sodium chloride, if you were to separate the two elements into sodium, you would know that sodium is actually quite unstable and can react quite violently. Chlorine lacks an electron and on its own is actually toxic. But when they share electrons together, then you have something known as table salt, something which is used in everyday life, right? So another example we learn from chemistry, but what's interesting is, again, the pairing, it's not a reflection of one another. These are two distinct entities coming together and working together in a way which produces something new and something which is beautiful, right? Similarly, what we learn from this is that through such pairing, what is unstable becomes stable, what was harmful becomes life-sustaining. But what we also learn is predictability, precision, right? And we learn a law which governs the universe. And if these laws were to fluctuate even slightly, we wouldn't have atoms coming together, molecules would collapse, and chemistry, i.e. matter itself, would cease to exist. This is another lesson that hopefully you can take away from this, which is pairing does not mean imitation and reflection. Two, everything requires something else for its existence, which is known as contingency, right? And the other thing which we come to learn, and this is something which we're so fortunate to be followers of the promised Messiah, ﷺ, when he describes taqdeer, predestination of Allah Almighty, he says taqdeer is quite literally this, that Allah Ta'ala has designed the universe in a certain way with certain principles and laws, and due to it, we then are able to achieve something known as science and knowledge. Without predictable laws and taqdeer, there would be no advancement in human knowledge and science. Why? Hazrat Muslim Maud simplifies this even further. He says, for example, if you wanted to grow an apple tree, if you didn't know which seed is required to be planted to grow an apple tree, and every time you plant a seed, it's always a gamble, and always you're guessing, maybe from this a pear would come about, or maybe from this cauliflower would come about, then there would be no system in the universe and everything would be so random, then we would never be able to establish any form of sciences at all, right? So again, from the system of pairing, we also learn about a systematic, precise, predictable law that Allah Ta'ala has set out for our own progress, right? So another thing that we learn from this verse. So again, a reminder, the lesson that we're taking from this is pairing in nature is not random cooperation. It is structure, dependence, governed by order. Creation does not stand alone. It holds together because it is designed to depend, right? Now, if we keep moving forward, what does the Holy Qur'an then say about pairs? The Qur'an is not saying everything is male and female, right? The Qur'an is not saying that reality is simplistic dualism, right? Simplistic dualism is that you just see opposites and you interpret this verse to mean that there are opposites in this world, there's light and there's darkness, yeah, that exists too. But when Allah Ta'ala is telling you to reflect and ponder and actually understand what I'm telling you when I'm pointing towards pairing, then it's not these simplistic ideas. In actuality, what I'm trying to teach you is creation is dependent, it's relational, and it's incomplete, right? Everything is incomplete on its own. It requires something else for it to become complete, right? It is contingent, right? So pairing reveals what? Contingency. Now, this is the hard part, right? You maybe so far you're thinking there's so much information, it's already so difficult. This is the part which we really need to understand, because now it will open to you one of the strongest arguments that are used against atheists today, right? And that is that if everything depends on something else, that means they can fail to exist, and it requires conditions for its existence, right? Which again, a broad umbrella term for this is everything is contingent, right? So every paired system in this world basically tells us, I'm trying to simplify this as much as possible, everything in existence is telling us that I cannot exist on my own. But there's a problem here. Contingency cannot explain itself. Contingency, this idea that everything requires something else to exist, is not sufficient to explain why everything exists in the first place, right? Contingent things do not exist by themselves, they depend on something else. But the thing is, if everything depends on something else, nothing is fully ever explained. What does that mean? If even an infinite chain, each link still depends, the whole chain could still fail to exist, right? So that's the example that we need to understand, or that's the point that we need to understand fundamentally. If we think about how everything depends on something else to exist, one of the basic examples is, so it's similar to a chain, right? A chain consists of rings. So you connect one ring with the other and the next ring and the next ring, and hopefully you have a long enough chain which you can then ultimately connect to something at the top so the chain will hang. But if there isn't anything right at the top which doesn't depend on other things for it to exist, then that chain wouldn't exist either. The chain would fall down. And that's basically the fundamental message that is being given to us from this particular verse of the Holy Qur'an, right? Otherwise, why is Allah Ta'ala pointing out to us that everything is created in pairs so that you may ponder and reflect? It's not for you to have this simplistic reflection that, oh yeah, look, there's yellow, and then there's yellow, or then there's eyes, and there's two of those, and there's two ears, and there's two, etc. There's a fundamental, deeper message in this particular verse of the Holy Quran, which is that because everything is paired and everything depends on something else to exist, then there must be something to sustain everything which is under it. Otherwise, nothing is ever fully explained, right? Because then the question would always be there, which is, why does anything exist at all? Right? Reason points to something that does not depend, something that exists by itself, right? And this is quite literally now, there are many YouTube videos now on this basic concept where individuals who consider themselves to be atheistic, this they consider to be one of the most potent proofs for them, logically speaking, for the existence of God. Because when they keep going down this chain, they come to realize that there must be something at the top which sustains everything at the bottom, right? Which is known as the necessary cause or the necessary being, right? If everything is contingent, you can't have an infinite chain of contingency, because there has to be something at the top for everything else to ultimately exist and sustain itself. If there isn't something at the top, then nothing would technically exist and nothing would be able to sustain itself at all. And that being at the top we describe as the necessary cause of being. And in very simple terms, if everything needs support, again, if you're struggling to understand this concept, this is the most basic way this can be presented to you. If everything needs support, right, then there must be something that does not, right? Because if there's a chain, ultimately you can string as many rings together, but if there isn't something at the top holding that chain will never stand, right? And this is the fundamental message that the Qur'an is telling us. Now there's a few more things which is wonderful. So what the Qur'an is telling us is that there must be a necessary being. This is something which is incredibly exciting. This is a point that Hazrat Muslim Maud radiallahu anhu makes, and I promise you, you will not, I have not heard any scholar in the modern age come up with this concept at all. I've only read it from the writings of Hazrat Muslim Maud radiallahu anhu. I haven't come across any new age scholar who has millions of followers, come up with this concept about the unity of Allah. So Allah Ta'ala, what as a Muslim Maud explains, so far you've understood the idea of pairing. Everything is contingent and requires something else for it to exist, but everything inherently is different, and the differentiation and variation is what results in something beautiful and harmonious, right, for existence, for something to exist. So from this argument we come to learn that ultimately in this system of contingency there must be something at the top, right, which sustains everything, otherwise nothing which exists could exist, right? So far so good. The Qur'an argues, and Hazrat Muslim Maud radiallahu anhu argues on the basis of the Qur'an, whoever this necessary being is, he must be one. Not only should there be a necessary being, but by definition, this necessary being has to also be one. Why? Because again, the concept of pairing teaches us this. What does it teach us, right? So reason points to, what does this teach us? That everything which is contingent is a compound. As a Muslim उर्दू में फरमाते हैं कि हर चीज़ जो है वो मुरक्कब हुआ करती है दुनिया में. Whatever exists is a compound. Why is it a compound? Because it requires something else for it to exist, right? Because what is a compound? It's made of parts. It's made of something. It requires something else for its existence. It depends on structure. It depends on something else to provide it some sort of stability and structure. And ultimately, if you take it apart, then it will break down, right? And Hazrat Muslim Maud radiallahu anhu literally says that ultimately, what is destruction? Fana kis cheez ko kehte hain? It is when you take away the constituents of something that enables something to exist. उन मुरक्कबात में जब आप जुजियात को आहिस्ता आहिस्ता निकाल दें तो फिर तबाही आती है ना. Things start to atrophy, or something known as destruction, they ultimately cease to exist. It is when the compound breaks down that it ceases to exist. But the whole argument of pairing and contingency points us to the fact that everything in existence has to be contingent. It has to be a compound, right? But also this argument teaches us that at the top there must be a necessary being which is able to sustain everything that is compound. But then by definition, whoever that necessary being is must be one, because only something which is one cannot be broken down, right? So a necessary being cannot be composed, cannot be divided, cannot depend on parts. And that is exactly what the Holy Qur'an states in Surah al-Ikhlāṣ. Say, He is Allah, the One. Ahad quite literally means, there's different ways in which you can say one in Arabic, but the term Ahad literally refers to that type of one that cannot be broken down at all. It cannot be made into constituents. Allah, the eternal refuge, i.e. Samad, He's independent. He neither begets nor is He begotten. He is neither, what does it mean to be born? Male and female comes together, they bring their specialized contribution and they produce something new, but ultimately that baby was contingent upon the male and female. And this is why Allah Ta'ala is not, why sometimes, as children sometimes, even as adults, we read Surah al-Ikhlāṣ and we say, why is Allah Ta'ala saying He's not born? Because there's a very deep meaning to being born. When you're born, you have to be contingent on something. So Allah cannot be born because He's one. And neither does He give birth, He creates. Right? Because ultimately He's always going to be separate to the creation. And there is none like unto Him, i.e. He is unique. So from these verses we understand Allah cannot be paired. He does not depend on anything else. Allah cannot be multiplied. He is singular and necessary, unlike contingent creation, unlike us. God cannot be broken down. He is not composite, unlike everything in the universe. And in short, while creation exists in pairs, compounds and dependencies, hopefully I've managed to elaborate that as best as possible, God exists independently and necessarily, and is the ultimate foundation of all existence. So from this one verse of the Holy Qur'an, that He has created everything in pairs so that you may observe. Look at how much knowledge can be ascertained from that one verse of the Holy Qur'an about how life is, the nature of life, the nature of existence, the nature of God Himself, right? And just to conclude, we'll end with a life lesson, because I believe that is also very important. It's all well and good to appreciate the science and the wonder of creation, etc. But the Qur'an ultimately is a book which is supposed to transform us as individual beings in society, right? To improve ourselves. So what is the life lesson you can take away from everything that's been described so far? Pairs in creation teach us that difference is not deficiency, it is complementarity. Right? Sometimes we try so hard in our relationships to make the other person become like us. But that's never the objective. That's not what the Holy Qur'an teaches us. Because if you force someone to become like you, you'll no longer be able to continue on a journey which results in enlightenment. Right? Hence why Hazrat Rasul Kareem sallallahu alaihi wasallam says that if you try to bend a woman to your will too much, then eventually she will break. Because she was never meant to be like you, just as much as you were never meant to be like her. Right? So each partner carries unique strengths and roles, and it is our responsibility to appreciate what our partner brings to the relationship rather than trying to make them like us. Right? So these differences are designed to allow cooperation, balance and growth, and we ultimately complete our spiritual journey together, because marriage is described as half of faith. Our better half helps us fulfill our relationship with Allah, right? So it gives us a better appreciation of why marriage is described as half of faith. Because it quite literally puts you in a position to work as a pair towards a greater good. And without that pairing, then you would leave so much for exploration that would go completely unnoticed, right? There would be so much that you would not be able to achieve without it. But when you're in it, if you don't appreciate the differences and you don't appreciate the variety that you both bring, then again you will collapse the system, right? We fracture relationships when we undermine the unique qualities we bring and do not value what God has enabled us to uniquely contribute. Right? The Prophet ﷺ says, an individual harbors many desires. Who has knowledge of the hidden matters of destiny and decree? Life never moves in parallel with one's wishes. A person's longings are one thing, but the design of fate and destiny is quite another. And it is this phenomenon which is true to life. Bear in mind that the circumstances of a person's life are in the knowledge of God Almighty. Who knows what life has in store for them? This is why an individual must constantly awaken their heart to make it vigilant. Ultimately, what the Prophet Messiah ﷺ is describing is that we think one thing, and life has something in store for us, something separate in store for us altogether. Right? Ultimately, life is in the hand of Allah. There's only so much we can do as individuals to make the most of life, and we sometimes try to control life so much that we think everything is within our hands. But ultimately that will happen, which is the decree of Allah, and it is better to follow that design of Allah and appreciate the differences and work with one another rather than fracture our relationships and move away from the design of Allah. So the takeaway, life and marriage flourish when we value our differences, honor our unique roles, and trust in God's design. So the question that maybe we can ask ourselves as we go away today, do you spend your time chasing what was never meant for you, or do you attend to the responsibilities God has entrusted you with? Right? We are all unique contributors in society. Allah Ta'ala has granted us our own individual journeys that we are meant to make and contribute to society and our relationships. Instead of trying to actualize what is destined for us, जो Allah Ta'ala ने हमारे लिए मुक़द्दर किया है, right? Do we chase after things that were never really meant for us? That's a question that's important to ask, because ultimately this idea of contingency and pairing teaches us this, that ultimately we should try to achieve what Allah Ta'ala has designed for us and contribute in that way, rather than chasing after those things that were never meant for us and fracturing the system that Allah Ta'ala has put us in, right? So that brings us to the end.